Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us again for another one of our CEU courses. Just a few reminders before we get started that once you get logged in, you will be time-stamped in and you will be time-stamped out once you exit the webinar. We do have to watch these live to be able to get credit for your CEUs, so rewatching them at a later time does not count. You must stay logged in the entirety of the CEU course to get credit for the CEU. Our next CEU is brought to us by Brittany Chesser of Texas A&M AgriLife, Aquatic Vegetation Management Basics. Ms. Chesser is the lead diagnostic scientist at Texas A&M University Aquatic Diagnostic Laboratory. This program will cover the basics of why aquatic vegetation needs to be controlled, when aquatic plants become a problem, identifying aquatic plant species, how to select an appropriate herbicide, biological or physical control method, and how to apply control options. At this time, we're going to turn it over to Ms. Brittany Chesser, Texas A&M AgriLife, on aquatic vegetation management basics.
Thank you. Going to go ahead and try to share my screen. Okay, it's not letting me share my screen. Okay, so we'll see if I'll be able to share my screen in a minute, but I just wanted to go ahead and start talking about some of the resources that may be or that are available to you for aquatic vegetation management. So like she said, I am the Aquatic Vegetation Management Program Specialist at Texas A&M, and I am fairly new to Texas. This is a completely new position with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. So it's been about a year that this position has been operating. And so previously in the past, we've had fishery specialists address our aquatic vegetation management needs. So now we're kind of getting a little bit of a different perspective on aquatic vegetation management. And so one of the resources available to you is the Aquaplant website. So that is aquaplant.tamu.edu. I keep getting someone asking me to start my video, but I actually need to share my screen and it's not letting me do that. Okay. I've now got that
we got you
option.
There we can share screen. There we go.
Yes. Awesome. So, okay. Now we can go ahead and get started. So this is the Aquaplant website that I was talking about a second ago. There's actually over 200 aquatic plants on this resource, and you can see the URL at the bottom here. So you can actually go on this resource and it will help you identify what aquatic plant you are trying to manage. It'll have all of the key characteristics listed out. These are very simple characteristics. It's definitely not what you're going to find in a field guide. Those can be a little complicated, and it's very determining factors. So once you're able to identify what you're trying to manage, it'll actually have all of the effective management options listed for that plant, whether you're looking for mechanical, biological, or chemical. We also have some online classes listed on this site and some other resources as well. If you look on the right-hand side, right at the bottom, you'll see aquatic herbicide tables. And this is just a screenshot of one of the pages in this table. It's a 3-page document, and this is something that I highly suggest people print out, especially if they're in the field and they're not able to get any internet access. No, it's not going to necessarily help you identify what you're trying to manage, but it is a very quick resource for what to use for effective control in terms of herbicides. And so if you look at the top, we have all of our available or all of our active ingredients that are labeled for aquatic use. We'll talk about that a little bit in a second. And then on the left-hand side, we have our major aquatic vegetation groups. And then in the middle, we have our ratings for each active ingredient, and they rate from fair all the way to excellent. And at the bottom, you'll see the commonly available trade names that are aquatically labeled. And so again, this is just something, I personally keep this in my truck. I keep this on me at all times, just as a quick reference. We are in the process of updating this sheet. So hopefully in the next couple of months, we'll have that updated just with some minor changes. So getting into aquatic vegetation and aquatic vegetation management, there may be different reasons that you're managing for aquatic vegetation. A lot of people have different reasons for having different ponds. They might have a pond strictly for livestock use, livestock watering. They may have a pond strictly for fisheries. They may have a multi-use pond. They may have a recreational pond. And so everybody's goals are different. So it's important to keep that in mind during this PowerPoint or during this presentation. Aquatic vegetation isn't always bad. There are different types of aquatic vegetation, different species that do have a lot of wildlife value. There are people who are actively seeking some of our native pondweeds, like you see at the upper left-hand corner. This is American pondweed, and waterfowl love American pondweed, as well as some of our native pondweeds as well. And so there are aquatic plant nurseries where you can get this, and you can get these beneficial aquatic vegetation. Obviously, when you look at the right-hand side of the screen, you can see that aquatic vegetation can get extremely out of hand as well. And so it's not always for, everyone to be putting that into their pond. What you see at the top right-hand corner is actually a pond full of spatterdock and banana lily or floating hearts lily, and this is completely covered this whole area, and it can be really detrimental to the over ecosystem of the pond. It's limiting the sunlight to get into the water, and it's lowering the dissolved oxygen for your other aquatic organisms. So of course that's really going to affect you if you have a fisheries pond. If you have a recreational pond, you're not really going to want to go swimming in that. That can hinder it. And then some of your other pond uses may be limited as well. If you look at the bottom left-hand corner, you've probably seen this in the news a lot. This is your typical run-of-the-mill blue-green algae. And so blue-green algae is, something that you do not want in your pond. It can cause negative effects, even death in your companion animals or in your livestock. Even if it isn't deadly to humans, if they're not actively ingesting it, it can also cause irritation to the skin. So that may be another reason for management. Looking all the way on the lower right-hand side, this is just to show you the overall color of the ponds. A lot of people really want their ponds to be crystal clear, and you don't always want a fishbowl. So having this nice emerald green color is actually an indicator that you have a healthy pond system. So the phytoplankton, we also call them planktonic algae, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, are actually what give your pond produce about 80% of the pond's oxygen. And so you definitely need that in your pond, or you're going to have a lot of issues. So looking at proactive management or prevention, there's a few things that you should be starting to think about right now before you're going to have a lot of vegetation issues in the upcoming spring. One of the first things you can do is deepen your pond edges. So when you're constructing or renovating your pond, you want to make sure that you're maintaining the pond edges to about 2.5 to 3 feet. This is because over time, these pond edges are going to become worn down by rain, wind, and livestock. And this is going to widen the overall pond and increase the shallow areas. When these shallow areas are increased, this is causing a lot of sunlight to actually touch the pond bottom, and this is helping aquatic vegetation establish and thrive. And so that's important to keep in mind. The overall goal is to have aquatic vegetation constricted to a small ring around the edge of a pond. Grass carp, we're going to talk about them in a little bit more detail in a minute, but they can be stocked at proactively at 5 fish per acre. But before choosing this prevention method, it's important to remember if you have a new pond, it may take several years before there are enough nutrients for the vegetation to grow in your pond. So grass carp will have something to consume. And so I don't typically recommend this unless of year after year you're having problems with the same species and grass carp happen to consume those species are very efficient in controlling them. Fertilization, this is a big one, and surprisingly, a lot of people haven't heard of fertilizing their ponds. This is different than fertilizing your terrestrial systems. You want to find a fertilizer that is actually high in phosphorus. And so overall, what this does is this prevents rooted plants from establishing by limiting the amount of light that reaches the pond bottom. So again, that's the overall goal in prevention. But this also helps create a strong food chain for your aquatic organisms. So this actually provides a boom in these phytoplankton, which again increases dissolved oxygen. And then your zooplankton feed on that, and then your larval fishes, and then you can see how that progresses to maybe some of your larger fish that you want out of your pond. So if you do plan on fertilizing your pond, the initial application should begin when your water temperatures are between 60 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and then you may have to follow up with smaller applications. This is very, very important. You do not want to fertilize your pond if the vegetation is already established. This will actually make the problem 4 to 6 times worse. And I've seen it happen many of times. And so you might need to chemically treat before you fertilize, depending on how quickly your vegetation is establishing. I also have pond dyes. They're listed on there as well. They come in all different types of colors. This may be beneficial to you if you want more of, if you have more of a recreational pond and you want a certain aesthetic. Dyes do shade like fertilization, but they do not offer a food chain enhancement. So we typically do not recommend these for ponds that have fish in them, just because you could be, or really you are taking away a food source from them. So the only exception is if you feed your fish, and even then you are still taking away certain food sources. So going in to more of a reactive management standpoint, your mechanical, biological, and chemical control. We're going to go into mechanical control. So this is when you're using a physical means to eliminate or decrease the presence of pests. And so this can temporarily alleviate your vegetation issues. Usually it's short-lived. I do not recommend mechanical control in most cases, just because it's very labor intensive. You require a lot of frequent cutting. It does not completely eliminate. So if you think about it like a haircut, you're going to cut it and it's going to continuously grow back. It can actually make the problem worse if done incorrectly. So there's certain species like hydrilla where if you begin raking it out of your pond, those little fragments even less than an inch, can reestablish and become a new plant. So you can literally be creating hundreds thousands of new plants when you're trying to manage with mechanical control if you're not doing it properly. Of course, it can be expensive as well. So a lot of these, different options. So your pond liners, your cut and harvest barges or dredges, some of your even your skimmer equipment that people that manufacturers are trying to sell, they are very expensive. So it's important to keep this in mind. And a lot of these plants, you'll see as we kind of progress on, mechanical control may not be an option at all just due to their size or, again, the way that they reproduce. Moving on to biological control, this is the form of control that uses other organisms to eliminate or decrease the presence of pests. So typically when you think of biological control for aquatic vegetation, you might think of insects like the Salvinia weevil and the alligator weed flea beetle that has been in some of our news releases, or Texas Parks and Wildlife Department puts out a lot of information on them. Or you might think of some of our herbivorous fish. So the insects that I mentioned, and a lot of the others that you will find being mentioned on the internet, they're not typically produced on a commercial scale. So usually they're not readily available to the public. And so you might have a hard time in finding these. And so typically, again, they're not going to be an option. Additionally, most insects die during the winter and must be restocked each year. And a lot of research has come out to show that these insects will not actually kill the plant, but they will just stop it from growing. So this is really good in instances, where you see in a public water body, they're trying to stop the growth of giant salvinia, but this may not be the most efficient way in your pond that you're trying to manage. And so when you think of herbivorous fish, you have two options. You have triploid grass carp and you have Mozambique tilapia. So just to kind of compare them side by side. So in Texas, you can stock sterile triploid grass carp once you obtain a permit through Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. They will require you to put a fish barrier on any of your spillways or overflow pipes in order to limit escapees. Depending on if you get approved or not, you can get up to 10 grass carp per acre per year. Even though it is recommended about 7 to 15 grass carp per acre, depending on how much coverage you have, what certain species you have. And so if you do get the max 10 and you find that they're just not keeping up with your vegetation needs, then you can go ahead and apply the next year for 5 or even 10 more. And so they are effective for about 5 to 7 years. After that, their consumption really slows down. And so typically you will need to restock more, but again, they will be effective for that long. You will see at the bottom the different species that, some of the species that they're effective at controlling. And I like to put kind of a mix of this because a lot of people think that these fish will just consume any aquatic vegetation. Well, they do have palates, just like humans. And so certain species, even if they're submerged in the water, they're not going to control effectively. Also, with that being said, they're not going to just control the non-native invasive plants like your hydrilla. They're also going to control some of those native beneficial plants that you might be managing for your wildlife, like your bushy pondweed, American pondweed, Illinois pondweed. And so again, you need to evaluate what your overall goals are before you stock these triploid grass carp. Looking on the right-hand side, we have our Mozambique tilapia. These do not require a permit, but they have to be Mozambique tilapia. Any other species you're not going to be able to get in a pond system. You will have to stock them yearly because they actually die off when the water temperature is less than 55 degrees Fahrenheit. If we have a mild winter, they may last, 2 to 3 years, but just be expected to stock them every year. And usually it's recommended to stock them at about 15 to 20 pounds of mixed sex tilapia. You're going to want to stock them once the water temperature is stabilized over 65 degrees Fahrenheit, just so, again, it doesn't dip below and you have a die off as soon as you put them in. They are effective at controlling duckweed and azolla, and they will consume some filamentous algae, but they're not necessarily a complete control option for filamentous algae. Usually a lot of the offspring are the ones that feed off of that filamentous algae, and so sometimes they're incorporated into a integrated pest management plan, which we'll talk about in a second. They are not a control option if there is a large bass population due to predation. This is just a quick screenshot of the triploid grass carp permit. This is just to show that it's really simple. And again, you can find that on Texas Parks and Wildlife, their website. Going into chemical control. So it's important, you see all of these active ingredients listed up here. It's important to note that even though these products may contain, or even though a product you're looking at may contain one of these active ingredients, it's not necessarily labeled for aquatic use. So an example is you will see glyphosate up here as an active ingredient for aquatic vegetation or aquatic use. You may be familiar with Roundup that has the active ingredient glyphosate in it. Roundup is not labeled for aquatic use. So that's actually, that actually is illegal to use on aquatic vegetation in your pond or water system. And so kind of a sister or cousin of that would be rodeo. So rodeo's active ingredient is glyphosate, but it is labeled for aquatic use. And you will find that these aquatic use herbicides are 2 to 3 times more expensive than your terrestrial herbicides. But your terrestrial herbicides, even though they have that active ingredient in them, they have other ingredients that will actually burn fish gills and amphibian skins. And so it can really be detrimental to your overall system. You will see on here, if you've ever attended one of these seminars on aquatic vegetation management, we have added a new herbicide to the list, and this is fluoroprioxorphen benzoyl. And so right now, unfortunately, we only have one trade name. It's Procyllicor EC, and it's only available through the company that sells it for people who are certified in applying it. So unfortunately, this is not available usually to you in your pond unless if you go out and hire someone. And so I don't really talk about that in a lot of control options, and you'll see listed on the Aquaplant website that it has that under it, and that's why. Going into your typical classifications, which you may or may not be familiar with, you have your contact herbicides and your systemic herbicides. Contact herbicides cause immediate cell damage at the point of contact. They're very fast acting. They cause above ground tissue death, and we typically use these on some of our annual species, like some of our submerged vegetation. And so examples or common examples that you'll see are copper and diquat, and of course there's some others, but those are going to be the most available to you. And then we have our systemic herbicide options. These are translocated throughout the plant. They're slow acting. They cause total plant mortality, and we typically use these to control our perennial and our woody species, for instance, our water lilies. And the ones that you'll most commonly see or are more available to you or more efficient on a lot of different plants that you'll come in contact with is glyphosate, 2,4-D, and then fluoridone. Glyphosate and 2,4-D are going to be some of your cheaper options, and fluoridone is actually going to be your more expensive option. And the reason for that is fluoridone, it can be used on a lot of your submerged, floating, and emergent vegetation, but it cannot be used as a spot treatment. It is a full system treatment because it takes, it has a contact period of over 30 days. It can take up to 90 days for complete plant death, but it actually provides up to 1 year of effective control. And so depending on what you have, the size of your pond, it may be beneficial to go ahead and kind of bite the bullet and go for the more expensive herbicide option. I like to do a quick comparison of when I talk about copper complexes versus copper sulfate or copper chelate. This is kind of showing them side by side. So they're both metallic copper. They both have metallic copper as the active ingredient, and copper as a heavy metal. What does it do when it gets in a pond? It's going to sink, and both will eventually sink. Yes, but copper sulfate is usually found in a crystallized form, and if not dissolved in the water prior to application or placed for, if you want to say, in a burlap sack to drag via boat, the crystals will actually sink to the bottom before dissolving, and this will result in an ineffective or imbalanced treatment. Even if it is mixed properly, it is still going to only be active for up to 1 hour. Copper chelate, on the other hand, is actually combined or chelated with other organic compounds, and it will keep the copper suspended and active in the water longer for about 4 to 6 hours. So why is this important? Copper is a contact herbicide. So if you remember the last slide, everything that you want it to kill, it needs to touch. And so this is going to be very difficult when you're trying to treat with what copper commonly is known for treating, and that's algae. You want to hit a lot of algal cells in one application, and so copper chelate will be your more effective option. Not saying that you can't use copper sulfate, but I'm just pointing out another option for you that you might not have heard of. A lot of people, when copper is recommended, they get concerned about it being toxic to aquatic organisms. And as long as you follow the label, which is legally required, you will not, you do not have to worry about this. And as long as you accurately measure your pond and know your pond size, you're not overestimating or underestimating, then you will have an efficient treatment that isn't toxic to aquatic organisms. With that being said, if you are overly cautious about this, copper chelate is less toxic, relatively speaking, than copper sulfate. And so I just wanted to cover that real quick. Okay, so one of the first steps in actually managing your aquatic vegetation is being able to identify what you're trying to manage. You'll notice that in each of these classifications that we're going to go over, there's a lot of very similar herbicide recommendations or management recommendations that you would follow, but they do vary from species to species. And so if you're not able to effectively or accurately identify what you have in your pond, then you're not going to be able to manage it efficiently. So we have our first classification is algae. They are primitive, non-seed bearing plants with no roots, stems, or true leaves. We have our floating plants, which are classified by all parts of the plant floating, which includes the roots. Submerged plants, so these are characterized by being mostly underwater and rooted with flaccid or limp stems. And then emergent vegetation. These plants are rooted with stiff or rigid stems with all or parts of the plant standing above the water surface. And so I will note here real quickly, water lilies and similar species are actually classified as an emergent plant because they do have a thick tuberous root that goes under the sediment, and of course their leaf is floating at the surface or slightly suspended above along with their flowers. So they are considered an emergent type of vegetation. So kind of going into algae, there are 3 different classifications. The first one we're going to, within algae, the first one we're going to go over is planktonic algae. So again, this is what I was talking about in the beginning. It can be very beneficial. These are single-celled, free-floating algae. They really exist anywhere, wherever the sun penetrates. They're also known as phytoplankton. This is what gives your water a greenish tint. This is what produces 80% of your pond's dissolved oxygen. This is what establishes, the food chain. But of course, a lot of it's a double-edged sword. And so there can be too much planktonic algae under certain conditions. It can actually not be beneficial. And so our blue-green algae, even though they're technically considered a bacteria, they are still labeled underneath this planktonic algae classification. So in general, planktonic algae colors the pond water shades of green, blue-green, brown, or variations in between. If you look at these pictures that you see here, it kind of looks like someone dumped paint all in the pond. This color is staying up at the top of the surface. You might see, not only do you see that bright red, which always is problematic, right, when you look into your pond, but it might have an oily sheen to it. And these are typically conditions that you're going to see in, the dead of summer. So when you're going through maybe a little bit of a drought, there's not getting a lot of water in there, and all of these nutrients are being concentrated. And so that's when you will see your blue-green algae bloom. Obviously, you're going to want to treat that as soon as you see it. And with blue-green algae, your types of control, since mechanical control and biological control aren't any option, or there are no options, you will treat with either chelated copper complexes or copper sulfate. Moving on to filamentous algae. So this is the number one thing I get calls about. This is typically what people refer to as pond scum or pond moss. It has that woolly-like texture. It's made of these single cells that form these long visible chains and threads and filaments. And again, it resembles that wet cotton. So what a misconception that a lot of people have is that the time that they see all of these nice floating mats up at the top of their pond is actually when they have filamentous algae. So I'll get calls in August and I'll say, I just had this filamentous algae, this pond moss show up in my pond. What do I do now? Well, when you start seeing those mats, that's actually when the algae is already dying off. And so filamentous algae starts growing in the spring at the bottom of your pond, and it's very heat intolerant. And so when the temperatures begin warming up in the winter, it'll begin dying off and then rising to the surface. So that's why if you've ever stained a pond, you'll see that filamentous algae, when it's actively growing, is, a deep green color. It's hard to pull apart. And then what you see at the top of the water surface actually kind of resembles snot. It's this yellow, blue-green color. And so you do not want to be targeting what's floating at the water surface. You actually want to be targeting what's underneath in the spring before it gets to that point. And so in terms of control, chelated copper complexes or copper sulfate are effective. However, they will only kill certain species of filamentous algae. There are hundreds of species, and they will only kill certain species. Most of them but not all of them. And so if you're constantly treating with copper year after year, you're constantly selecting for these certain species to be able to thrive. And so in a couple of years, you're going to have a really hard algae to kill. And so we typically recommend maybe not every year, but at least every other year if you're going to treat it, to tank mix copper and diquat for the best results. And so diquat will kill those remaining species. On top of that, as an extra precaution or extra measure, after chemical treatment, filamentous algae will grow back. Once it's in your pond, it's always going to be coming back. You can stock Mozambique tilapia to keep up with any newly established filamentous algae. Moving on to macroalgae. So these are similar to our submerged vegetation. They're also confused with a lot of our rooted plants, which can cause some issues in terms of effective control, but they actually are multicellular algae that consists of these large algal cells. We have two genera that are found in Texas. It's CHARA and Nitella. But right here is CHARA, which is what is normally seen or is the most common. CHARA has these nice whorls with these what appears to be branchlets in about 8 to 16, depending on the CHARA species. And so it can be very commonly confused with especially COONTAIL, which is a type of submerged vegetation, and I'll show you the comparison later on. One of the distinguishing characteristics with CHARA is that if you actually crumple it, it smells like a skunk or it has this garlic-like odor. And so that strong odor, it lacks any roots or seeds. So that's another distinctive characteristic that you can use to tell it apart. It can be physically controlled through raking or staining, but it can reestablish from spores and fragments, so it's not typically something I recommend. Triploid grass carp are an effective option for CHARA. And of course, for chemical control, you have your chelated copper complexes or copper sulfate because it is an algae and not a submerged plant. Just going over the prevention considerations when we're talking about algae. So the number one reason for algae problems to develop in ponds is too much phosphorus in the water. So when the algae is treated and it dies, it releases all of the nutrients contained in it, including the phosphorus, back into the water. And so in order to prevent algae from coming back as quickly and requiring multiple applications, there's a few options that you see here on the screen. So the first one is a phosphorus binder. So this can be applied about 5 days after the algae is treated. And this will bind the phosphorus and lock it in an unavailable state so it can't be utilized by the algae or rooted vegetation again. And just an example of this product, I'm not endorsing it, but just an example is Phoslock. The second one you see is a sludge reducing product containing natural bacteria. The bacteria will actually digest the organic material in the ponds, which can be a source of nutrients for filamentous algae. And an example of this is NT Max. The third one you see is a water column clarifier. This can be applied at the same time or immediately after a copper treatment. And this clarifier are high performance liquid bacterial blends that fixate nitrogen and phosphorus. And most of the time, these products are just called water column clarifier. You'll see them from different companies like Natural Lake, Biosciences, etc. Moving on to floating plants. So again, this is if all parts of the plant, including the root, floats. So here, I talked about a little bit earlier how important it is to identify what you have before you're trying to treat. Someone sent me this photo on the left and told me that they had been using copper constantly to manage their algae, and they weren't sure why it wasn't working out. And then later on in the email, they start describing that the algae has a grainy texture, or they refer to it as sand algae. So that gave me a red flag, because as we just went over algae, you notice that I didn't say anything about a sand algae. And so I asked this person to send up closer up photos. And this is what you see on the right-hand side. So they actually had mostly watermill, also a little bit of duckweed as well. And these are not algae, these are actually floating plants. So as you can see, you can look a little bit closer, and you can understand that maybe from far away, if you don't actually investigate in your pond, you can maybe confuse them between your blue-green algae or some of your other algae. So looking at duckweed and watermill, they're both, most species are native in the duckweed family, and most of the watermill species are also native. They may be confused between each other because they're both very small, green, and egg-shaped, but they can be easily distinguished by duckweed actually having these little root nerves that you see at the bottom. And then watermill actually does not have these root nerves. So watermill is the exception. It is the world's smallest flowering plant, and it does not have a root, but it is still considered a plant and not an algae. So as you can see, you might look at the size comparison. Yes, duckweed is much larger, but if you don't have them side by side, size can be relative. So I like to go off another characteristic to tell them apart. So in terms of control of duckweed and watermill, they both have very similar treatment options. Duckweed and watermill, they can be physically controlled by raking or sanding from the pond surface, but as you can imagine, this is very difficult because of the size of the plant material. And then also, it's very difficult to control duckweed and watermill in general, just because they are notorious for building up these large seed beds in the sediment at the bottom of the pond when they are dormant. And so when you use even chemical control and you open up these spots and then they have sunlight touching them again, that triggers those seed beds to now float up to the water's surface. And so every time you're going to be killing it off, you're going to have more popping up. And for that reason, if you have a small pond, about 1.5 acres or less, and if you have duckweed and watermill or just one or the other, I highly recommend Floridone. It's going to save you money in the long run. You're not going to be reapplying, week after week. So it saves you on time. And so that is definitely when you would use kind of the more expensive systemic option. In terms of your contact options, which are, of course, a little bit cheaper, if you have both duckweed and watermill, flumiosin is your only contact option. If you have duckweed only, DIQUEED would be your lower cost contact option in compared to flumiosin. With that being said, you'll see tilapia and ducks on here. Tilapia will control duckweed, not as much for watermill control. And, it is called duckweed, but there have been studies showing that the number of ducks you would need to control 1 acre of duckweed is over 180 ducks per acre. And so that never seems sustainable to me. But of course, you can use tilapia and ducks at a lesser extent as part of an integrated management solution along with your chemical control. Ducks do create a lot of other issues, though. They are supplying a lot of nutrients in your pond. And so typically I stray away from that completely. Moving on to submerged vegetation. These are characterized by being mostly underwater and rooted with limp stems. So as you can see, submerged vegetation can be very confusing. When I get pictures like this, it's very frustrating because There are hundreds of submerged species, and you actually need to go in the pond and get it out of the pond to get a nice picture in order to create a management plan. You also want to see if it's a invasive non-native, and you may need to be handling that a different way as well. So looking at these two pictures, one of these is actually the macroalgae that we talked about a little bit earlier on. So that's the right hand side, and then the left hand side is a native pondweed. And so if you think that the right hand side is a type of submerged vegetation, and if you use one of these other herbicides, or really vice versa, you're not going to be using the most efficient or effective herbicide option. So coontail, this is the most common submerged species that I get questions about. It's also known as hornwort. It has these hard horn-like projections, and that is the reason why you'll see grass carp are actually rated as fair. If coontail is the only plant in the pond, grass carp might eat that, so I typically do not recommend them for coontail. They have this clustered fruit that has this berry-like appearance that you see right here. It has a seed with a round disc and 3 evenly spaced spines coming off of it. And it has these leaflets that are actually in whorls, and they're branched heavily. So again, this is always confused with CHARA, and the way you can tell it apart is coontail, which is on the left, has these nice leaflets that are branching or forked. There's other ways that you can tell them apart, of course, but this is just a really simplistic way to look at it. Coontail does have roots, but sometimes it's very loosely attached to the pond bottom, and so you may not see the roots at all. And so you may be thinking it's an algae, but again, this is how you can tell them apart. The best time to treat your algae floating in submerged vegetation is in the spring before a large biomass buildup. You need to be careful when you're treating with contact herbicides. Rotting vegetation will actually attract a lot of beneficial bacteria to help break it down, and these bacteria actually consume oxygen in the water column. So this is depleting the overall dissolved oxygen in your water system, which is very important. If you have fish, it will cause fish kills. So you are recommended to treat no more than 25 to 30% of your pond at a time. Wait 7 to 10 days for the material to die off, and then move on to the next section. If you're treating blue-green algae, we actually lower that amount. So you want to be treating about 10 to 15% of the pond, and then waiting that 7 to 10 days and then moving on. And that's because blue-green algae is actually the most toxic when it begins dying off. If you are treating blue-green algae, you also want to keep your any companion animals, livestock animals off of your pond for 2 weeks after treatment. A lot of this usually isn't an issue with systemic herbicides, but it's always good if you can to treat in smaller sections so you're not depleting the overall dissolved oxygen level. Moving on to emergent vegetation. So again, these are rooted with stiff or rigid stems with all or parts of the plant standing above the water surface. So this is the #1 emergent plant that I get calls about, and in general, it's just a very common inquiry throughout Texas. So there's a lot of different species found in Texas, but they all look relatively the same. So in its landform that you see over on the left, it might be confused with some of your other emergent plant species like alligator weed and smartweed. It grows erect with long lance-shaped leaves with green to pink stems, and it's easily identifiable by a 4-petal yellow flower when it's present. A lot of people, when it's in its landform, they'll actually mow over it because they don't even realize that it's there. And with that being said, typically they contact me when they start seeing these floating aquatic mats that you see here. So the aquatic form can actually form these islands or mats that their leaves adapt to become more thick, waxy, and rounded, and the stems become swollen, large, and filled with a foamy pith. And so these adaptations allow it to float. So here's just a closer up of the landform. It has this alternate leaf pattern that you see here. And if you look closely, it has these small leaf hairs on the underside of the leaf. But the big indicator, again, is that 4-petal yellow flower. Here's just a couple more pictures of the aquatic form. It's slowly starting to become more aquatic, more adapted in the water column. And then here's an up close of the aquatic form. As you can see, it almost forms a leaf arrangement that looks similar to a rose. For control of water primrose, you have 2,4-D and glyphosate as your more commonly available, cheaper herbicides. I will say that there is a species of water primrose that is glyphosate resistant. And so if you do use glyphosate and if it's not working on your water primrose, 2,4-D is the way to go. 2,4-D is usually the one I recommend over glyphosate for water primrose. You can mow or pool, especially the landform. Just make sure if you're mowing, you're not blowing the mower back into the pond. If you're pulling these aquatic mats, just remember that they will grow back pretty quickly. These are our lily-like plants, which I was talking about a little bit earlier. So they are emergent. We have our white water lily, yellow water lily, and our spatterdock. These are what their roots look like. So again, it's these thick tuberous roots. They actually store enough carbohydrates to last up to 7 years without getting any energy from the sun. So even if you're going in and burning off all of these nice green leaves, you could still have the root system persist underneath the sediment, and it's just going to keep popping up plants. So a lot of people, they'll introduce this into their ponds and they'll realize it's just very hard to manage. And so it gets out of control very quickly. So I typically recommend, if you have a large infestation, if you have a smaller pond, again, 1.5 acres or less, you're going to want to use Floridome to save on time, money, and this is going to be your most effective method of control in that instance. If you need to go with your cheaper options, or if you have a much larger pond, 2,4-D and glyphosate are what I recommend, but I recommend that you do not apply them at the highest labeled rate. You actually want to apply them at the lower labeled rate and do multiple applications. This actually gives it enough time to work the herbicide into the root system and not just burning off the leafy green material. So a lot of people make that mistake when they treat. They'll just instantly burn off that green material and it doesn't have enough time to work its way into the roots. This is the last plant we'll go over today. So this is SMARTWEED. This is also sometimes called water pepper. Again, it gets confused with a lot of your other emergent plants like your water primrose or your alligator weed. It has these flowers that are white to pink in clusters at the end, the terminal end of the plant that you see here, which does have wildlife value for your migratory birds and small mammals. The key identifying characteristic for SMARTWEED is, if you look right here in the middle, it says paper-like sheath called an ochrea. So you'll never need to know that word again, but just know that it's there. And so this paper-like sheath is wrapped around every node. So that's where a leaf meets the stem. And that's how you can tell them apart. There's a lot of different species found throughout Texas, but these are the key characteristics for all of those species. This doesn't usually become a huge issue. Most of the time people just want to know what this is. Sometimes people like this SMARTWEED for bank stabilization, for wildlife habitat, whatever. But if it does become out of hand, or if you do see it as a nuisance, glyphosate and 2,4-D are your best options. Here's just some more pictures of SMARTWEED. It can get pretty far in the water column, and it lasts, depending on what species it is, it can persist in the water column for a long period of time. And of course, you can see how it's taken over along the bank over here. The best time to treat emergent vegetation is in the fall when the plant is storing food for winter. Of course, you still, like any treatment, repeated treatments may be necessary, and you want to make sure when you're using your or when you're treating your emergent vegetation to use a good quality non-ionic surfactant. So this will increase the overall effectiveness by reducing the surface tension of the water. So always check your label to see if a surfactant is recommended. Quickly, I'll go through this, just that the US EPA regulates the introduction of all pesticides into or over water. This is a very lengthy process, but the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality enforces the regulations set upon by the EPA. And so this is just a lot of language to tell you that if you reach a certain annual threshold, you do qualify for a general permit, which you have to fill out. And the annual thresholds for the general permit is if you are treating a treatment area of at least 100 acres in water or 200 linear miles at the water's edge. And so typically this is not a lot of people I work with, but I like to put this information in there. You do not need to file for the general permit if you're a level 2 or 3 operator. A level 2 operator is when you are applying to 1 acre or more of water. And if you're a level 2, you are required to fill and keep on site a self-certification form. And level 3 operators, this is if you're applying to less than 1 acre of water, and you are not required to fill out that form, but it's still recommended because for the most part it's there to kind of cover your butt in case if something happens. So here's just a screenshot of the self-certification form. Again, you can find that on TCEQ's website. We also have a link on our Aquaplant website. It's pretty simple to fill out. They make it very easy, so it's not a burden to you. And with that, I would like to give you my email in case if you have any questions. I always recommend that you reach out to your county extension agent first. Most of the time, I like to get them involved anyway, and they already know different treatment options that I'm going to recommend. But of course, feel free to contact me, and you'll see these pictures at the bottom. I like to include them because if you're trying to identify what's in your pond, it's always nice to have up close, high quality photos, preferably be in front of a white background. And so with that, I see there's some questions in the chat, maybe. Okay, so most of the questions, it seems to just be if you can get copies of the slides after the seminar. I have sent those slides to the producers co-op. I don't know if they will be sending out any slides, but you can also contact me and I can give you my slides as well.
Thank you, Ms. Chesser. We sure appreciate you giving us that thorough walkthrough of aquatic plants today. We're going to go ahead and start preparing for our next webinar. We're spilling over a little bit into the next session, but again, we appreciate everything AgriLife Extension does in supporting us and supporting everybody in the field who's out there working to make sure that we're following all the rules and we're understanding what we're doing. We're making appropriate applications, identification of plants properly, and just doing everything the right way. So we're going to end this webinar session, so please sign out and sign into the next one, and we're going to get that one started